They say the late 70s were the dark ages for American muscle, and they're not wrong. Horsepower was dying, torque was choked, and the sound of freedom was getting muffled by the ever-tightening grip of government regulations. The Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, had decided that the high-powered, gas-guzzling beasts we loved were dangerous for the planet, and in their mission to save the air, they ended up gutting an entire era of performance cars. If you were a gearhead back then, you didn't just watch your favorite cars lose their roar, you felt it. You watched the soul get drained from Detroit's proudest creations. I mean, by 1979, the Z28 Camaro, the poster child of Chevy's performance game, was limping along with a measly 185 horsepower. And the Ford Mustang? That thing was pushing out only around 140 horsepower, barely more than a family sedan. These weren't just cars anymore, they were shells of their former selves. And it was heartbreaking. But just when it seemed like performance was dead and buried, a couple of brothers in the middle of the Arizona desert decided they weren't going to take it anymore. They found a loophole so clever, so perfectly timed, that it brought real muscle back to the streets during one of the most horsepower-starved eras in American automotive history. And they didn't do it with just any car. No, they chose the Pontiac Trans Am, a car that already used attitude even in its weakened state, and turned it into a fire-breathing street machine worthy of the muscle car badge. They called it the Macho Trans Am, and if you were lucky enough to get behind the wheel of one of these in 1979, you weren't just driving fast, you were driving faster than almost anything else on the road. This is the wild, rebellious story of how two brothers took on the EPA, skirted the rules, and built one of the only real muscle cars you could buy new in the late 70s. Stick around, because by the end of this, you might just wish you could go back in time and order one yourself. And hey, before we hit the gas on this incredible ride, make sure you smash that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss stories like this. It's free, and it helps us keep bringing you the greatest automotive tales in history. So, how did two brothers from Arizona pull off such a stunt? The answer is simple: they were born into it. Kyle and Dennis Meacham grew up breathing the smell of motor oil and burnt rubber. Their father, Evan Meacham, was no ordinary man. He was a decorated World War II fighter pilot, a Purple Heart recipient, and the kind of guy who didn't just dream big, he went out and did big things. After returning home from the war in his mid-20s, Evan started a Pontiac and Rambler dealership in Phoenix, Arizona. He built it from the ground up, right in the heart of the post-war car boom, when American roads were filling up with chrome, fins, and big block V8s. Now, Evan's life would take some wild turns. Years later, he would go on to become the governor of Arizona. And not just any governor, he'd become the only one in the state's history to be impeached. In fact, he holds the dubious honor of being the first governor in the United States to face an impeachment trial, a recall election, and a felony indictment all at the same time. But that's a saga for a whole different type of channel. For our story, what matters is that his sons, Kyle and Dennis, grew up in the family dealership, soaking in Pontiac's golden era. They remembered the GTO glory days, the fire-breathing Super Duty Trans Ams, and the pride of American muscle at its peak. So, when the late 70s rolled around and Pontiac's once proud performance lineup had been neutered by emissions regulations, it didn't sit right with them. They weren't the kind of guys to shrug and say, well, that's just how it is now. They wanted to fight back. But here's the problem: as an official Pontiac dealership, Meacham Pontiac was bound by EPA rules. That meant they couldn't sell any new car with modifications that weren't officially certified by the EPA. Every Trans Am they sold had to be exactly as it rolled out of the factory, at least when it came to the drivetrain. If they tried to modify a brand new car and sell it as new, they'd be breaking the law. That would have been the end of the story if the Meacham brothers weren't so clever. They found the ultimate loophole. See, while Meacham Pontiac couldn't sell brand new modified Pontiacs, there was nothing stopping a completely separate company from buying those new cars, changing them, and then selling them as used. So, they created a new business, DKM, named after Dennis and Kyle Meacham. The plan was genius in its simplicity. The dealership would sell brand new Trans Ams to DKM. The moment DKM took possession, those cars would be officially titled. Even if they had 0 miles on the odometer, they were no longer new in the eyes of the law. And because they weren't new, the EPA's restrictions didn't apply the same way. They were now free to modify them as much as they wanted. Just like that, the brothers had cracked the code. They could now build and sell hopped-up Trans Ams to anyone willing to pay for the extra power, something no other Pontiac dealer in the country could legally do at the time. And yes, it is a little ironic that the father of these rule-skirting sons would later get impeached for political controversies. But hey, that's life. Sometimes history has a sense of humor. With the loophole locked in, it was time to bring their vision to life. Starting in 1977, DKM ordered brand new Trans Ams equipped with the W72/L78 package. This was the most performance-oriented setup Pontiac offered at the time, with a 200 horsepower Pontiac 400 cubic inch V8. Now, 200 horsepower might not sound like much today, but in 1977, it was one of the last respectable power numbers you could get from Detroit. From there, DKM went to work. They rejetted the carburetor for better fuel delivery, recurved the distributor for more aggressive timing, and swapped the stock exhaust for a set of hooker headers. They then ditched the restrictive Y-pipe single exhaust setup and replaced it with a true dual exhaust system. To keep it legal enough for the times, they added a second catalytic converter so that each bank of cylinders had its own cat. This not only helped emissions but drastically improved flow. They also made the car's hood scoop fully functional, pulling in cold, dense air straight into that Pontiac 400. They didn't open up the engines internally. That was intentional. Keeping the motor stock inside meant keeping reliability high and costs manageable. But the external changes alone made a huge difference. The result? A jump of about 50 extra horsepower. That brought total output to around 250 horsepower for the base Macho Trans Am. In an era when most performance cars struggled to crack 180 horsepower, that was a massive leap. And that was just the beginning. In 1978, DKM decided to go even bigger. They introduced a new range-topping setup, a draw-through turbocharger system from High Output Specialties, complete with water injection to keep things cool and detonation-free. That same Pontiac 400 now breathed under boost, cranking out a wild 330 horsepower. Think about that. In 1978, that kind of output put the Macho Trans Am right up there with the Aston Martin V8 Vantage and the Lamborghini Countach. We're talking world-class power numbers at a time when most American cars were barely keeping up with European sedans. Pair that turbo setup with the optional Doug Nash 5-speed manual transmission, and you had a car that could really stretch its legs. Now, early turbo systems weren't exactly the most reliable things in the world. The draw-through setup, in particular, had a reputation for being finicky. But when it worked, it was a monster. And while the Macho Trans Am had the straight-line speed to put a Corvette in its place, it wasn't a one-trick pony. Every Macho got the WS6 handling package from the factory, which included a better steering box, 3.42 rear gears, and upgraded suspension. DKM took it even further with adjustable Coney shocks, lowering springs, and wider 8-inch WS6 wheels. The result was a Trans Am that could carve corners with confidence while still ripping down the quarter mile. From there, customers could personalize their Macho however they wanted: Recaro seats, a Hurst short-throw shifter, custom hoods, you name it. Of course, all that performance and exclusivity came at a price. The base Macho added about $3,200 to the cost of a regular Trans Am. Considering a stock Trans Am was already close to $6,000, you were looking at around $9,200 for the DKM treatment. Go for the turbo setup, and you were over $12,000. That was Corvette money, but the Macho beat the Corvette where it mattered. In the quarter mile, a non-turbo Macho could run low 14s, nearly a full second quicker than the hottest Corvette of the time. It was faster, handled just as well, had more practicality, and let's be honest, it had way more attitude. Between 1978 and 1980, about 325 Macho Trans Ams were built, with around 20 of those being the ultra-rare turbo 5-speed cars. But all good things come to an end. By 1980, Pontiac phased out the 400 in favor of the smaller 301, which was much harder to squeeze power from. The magic combination that made the Macho so potent just wasn't there anymore. DKM ended production of the Macho Trans Am that same year. The brothers would keep modifying Trans Ams into the third-generation era, focusing more on handling than raw power, but the wild, rebellious spirit of the Macho was gone. It wasn't just about going fast, it was about giving the middle finger to the rules that had tried to kill the muscle car. That's what made it special. That's what made it unforgettable. And that's the story of the Macho Trans Am, one of the last true American muscle cars of its time, built by two brothers who refused to play by the rules. If you enjoyed this trip through automotive history, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next ride through the greatest stories in car culture. Until next time, keep the pedal down, enthusiasts.